November 20th, 1992. Windsor Castle, home to British monarchs for 900 years, was burning. Flames tore through the state apartments. Smoke poured from windows that had witnessed centuries of history. And inside, surrounded by fire, sat some of the most valuable art ever assembled by human hands. Leonardo da Vinci drawings, Rembrandt portraits, works by Rubens, Van Dyck, Vermeer. $5 billion worth of masterpieces, trapped in a medieval fortress turned inferno. Queen Elizabeth II arrived as firefighters battled the blaze. She didn't stand at a safe distance. She walked inside. She helped carry paintings out herself, piece by piece, racing against flames that consumed entire rooms within minutes. What she saved that day represents something far beyond its monetary value. It's the greatest private art collection on Earth, 5 centuries of acquisitions by British monarchs, treasures purchased, inherited, gifted, and occasionally stolen, all concentrated in one castle on the Thames. Most people who visit Windsor see the castle, the towers, the chapel, the changing of the guard. What they don't realize is what lies inside. Rembrandt paintings worth $50 million each. Over 500 Leonardo da Vinci drawings, the largest collection anywhere in the world, kept in a climate-controlled vault most visitors never see. Vermeer canvas is so rare that only 34 exist globally. And enough Canaletto paintings to fill an entire Venetian gallery. This is the story of how it all came to be there. The kings who built this collection, the queen who nearly lost it, and the masterpieces hidden behind royal walls that most people will never see. If you enjoy deep dives into history and architecture, consider subscribing. We explore the stories behind America and Britain's greatest estates. Let's begin with the fire. Chapter 1. The Night the Queen Saved Windsor. The fire started just after 11 in the morning, a spotlight in the private chapel. Faulty wiring, investigators would later conclude. The kind of accident that happens in buildings 9 centuries old, where modern electrical systems run through medieval stone. Within minutes, flames reached wooden beams in the ceiling. Within an hour, the fire had spread to 9 state apartments. St. George's Hall, 180 feet of medieval grandeur, became an inferno. The ceiling collapsed. Stone walls that had stood since 1300 cracked from the heat. Windsor Castle was destroying itself from the inside. The security guard on duty that morning followed protocol perfectly. He triggered the alarm. He called emergency services. And then he started moving art. Every member of staff at Windsor knows the evacuation procedure. It's drilled into them from day one. Which paintings to grab first, which route to take, where to assemble outside. Because Windsor isn't just a castle, it's a museum that happens to be someone's home. Within minutes, staff members were running through smoke-filled corridors carrying Rembrandt portraits, hauling Van Dyck canvases down staircases, passing priceless works hand-to-hand in a human chain that stretched from the state apartments to the safety of the courtyard below. 225 firefighters responded. They came from stations across Berkshire. Some arrived to find flames shooting through the roof. Others saw smoke visible from miles away across the Thames Valley. Queen Elizabeth II was at Buckingham Palace when she received the call. Windsor was burning. She drove straight there. She arrived to chaos, fire crews everywhere, smoke billowing from windows, staff members carrying furniture, tapestries, anything they could move. And the Queen, 76 years old, didn't observe from a distance. She walked into the castle and started helping. Eyewitnesses reported seeing her carry items out herself. Paintings, books, historical documents, whatever could be saved. Prince Andrew, who was actually at Windsor when the fire started, did the same. He later told reporters it was fortunate the fire happened during daylight. Had it started at night with fewer staff present, the losses would have been catastrophic. The fire burned for 15 hours. By the time firefighters finally contained it, 9 state apartments were destroyed or severely damaged. St. George's Hall was gone. The ceiling had collapsed entirely. Stone walls stood, but everything inside them had burned. And yet, remarkably, almost all the art survived. Over 300 paintings and drawings were evacuated. Rembrandt portraits that today would sell for $50 million each. Rubens' religious scenes, Van Dyck royal portraits, Canaletto Venice paintings, all carried to safety by staff members who knew exactly what they were saving. Some pieces couldn't be moved. They were too large, too fragile, or too firmly attached to walls. A few smaller items were lost in rooms that became completely engulfed before anyone could reach them. But the losses were minimal compared to what could have been destroyed. In one room, empty frames still hung on smoke-blackened walls. The paintings had been removed just minutes before the ceiling collapsed. Those frames stayed up for years afterward, a reminder of how close Windsor came to losing everything. The question everyone asked afterward was simple. How did staff know what to save first? How did they make those split-second decisions about which Rembrandt to grab, which Van Dyck to leave behind? The answer reveals something crucial about Windsor Castle. This isn't a museum where art hangs in climate-controlled galleries behind velvet ropes. It's a working royal residence where priceless masterpieces decorate rooms the Queen actually uses. Staff members see these paintings every day. They dust them. They adjust their lighting. They know every piece in the collection. When fire broke out, they didn't need to consult a catalog. They knew instinctively which works were most valuable, most historically significant, most irreplaceable. They grabbed Leonardo drawings from storage. They pulled Vermeer canvases off walls. They rescued pieces that art historians consider among the greatest treasures in Western civilization. Queen Elizabeth II called it the worst day of her life. Not because of the building damage. Buildings can be rebuilt. She was devastated by how close they came to losing the art. 5 centuries of collecting by British monarchs, nearly destroyed in a single afternoon. The fire raised an obvious question. What exactly was Windsor Castle protecting? What collection could possibly be worth billions of dollars? And how did it all end up in one medieval fortress on the Thames? To understand that, we need to go back 900 years. Back to when Windsor was just a wooden fort on a hill, and nobody had any idea it would become the greatest art repository in the private world. Chapter 2, 900 Years in the Making. Windsor Castle didn't start as an art gallery. It started as a weapon, 1070. William the Conqueror had just seized England. He needed fortresses to control his new territory. He built a ring of castles around London, each positioned a day's march from the next. Windsor was one of them. The location was strategic, a chalk cliff rising above the Thames, high ground with clear sightlines in every direction. Any army approaching London from the west would have to pass within view of Windsor's walls. William built quickly. Wood and earth, nothing fancy. A Mott and Bailey fort that could be constructed in months. The round tower we see today stands where William's original wooden keep once stood. Everything else has been rebuilt, expanded, redesigned, but the core position remains unchanged. Windsor still commands the same hill William chose nearly 1,000 years ago. Over the next 2 centuries, successive kings replaced wood with stone. They raised proper walls, added towers, built the first version of St. George's Chapel. Windsor evolved from temporary fortress to permanent royal residence. By the 1300s, it had become one of England's primary royal homes. Kings held court here. Parliaments met within its walls. The Order of the Garter, England's highest order of chivalry, made Windsor its headquarters in 1348. It still is. The castle grew with each generation. Edward III essentially rebuilt the entire upper ward in the mid-1300s, creating apartments grand enough for a medieval king. Henry VII added more. Elizabeth I updated defenses. Charles II in the 1670s transformed the state apartments into something approaching what we see today. Each expansion brought more space, more rooms, more walls that needed decoration, and that's when Windsor's transformation began, from fortress to palace, from military installation to art repository. The shift happened gradually. Medieval kings decorated their castles, certainly. Tapestries, religious paintings, heraldic displays. But these were decorations, not collections. Nobody thought of themselves as curators. That changed in the 1600s. Charles I in particular saw art differently than his predecessors. He didn't just want paintings on his walls. He wanted the best paintings. He wanted to compete with the great art patrons of Europe. He wanted a collection. He got one. And then he lost it. But we'll come to that. By the 1800s, Windsor had become what it remains today, the largest occupied castle in the world. 13 acres, more than 1,000 rooms, a working royal residence where the monarch actually lives, surrounded by art most museums would trade entire wings to possess. The scale is difficult to grasp. Windsor isn't one building. It's a complex of structures built over 9 centuries, all connected, all functioning as a single residence. The state apartments where tourists walk today occupy just a fraction of the total space. Behind those public rooms lie private apartments, offices, chapels, libraries, storage vaults, miles of corridors connecting hundreds of rooms most visitors never see. 39 British monarchs have lived at Windsor. Each left their mark. Each added to the structure, the collections, the history layered into these walls. Queen Victoria made it her primary residence after Prince Albert died in 1861. She essentially retreated to Windsor and stayed there for decades, mourning. The castle became synonymous with her widowhood. George V and Queen Mary lived here extensively. Elizabeth II considered it home. She spent weekends at Windsor throughout her reign and moved there permanently during her final years. She died at Windsor in September 2022 and is buried in St. George's Chapel. King Charles III continues the tradition. Windsor remains a working royal residence. The royal standard flies when he's present. Staff maintain the private apartments. The castle functions exactly as it has for centuries as both home and museum. That dual nature creates unique challenges. How do you preserve priceless art while also living with it? How do you open rooms to tourists while keeping other spaces private? How do you balance being a museum with being someone's actual house? Windsor manages it through careful zoning. The state apartments are public most of the year. Tourists walk through, see the art, then leave. The private apartments remain completely off-limits. Even staff access is restricted. And certain rooms serve dual purposes, switching between private and public depending on whether the king is in residence. The castle employs hundreds of people: curators, conservators, historians, security, maintenance, guides, an entire infrastructure dedicated to preserving both the building and everything inside it. Because what's inside Windsor isn't just valuable, it's irreplaceable. 900 years of accumulation, art purchased by kings who had unlimited resources, pieces that have been here so long that moving them feels unthinkable. But the collection almost didn't survive. Multiple times in Windsor's history, the art came close to being dispersed, sold, or destroyed. The 1992 fire was just the most recent threat. The greatest threat came much earlier, 1649, when a king lost his head and his entire art collection was put up for sale. Chapter 3: Charles I and the Collection That Vanished. Charles Stuart became King of England in 1625. He inherited a throne, 3 kingdoms, and almost no art worth mentioning. That bothered him. Charles had grown up around European courts. He'd seen the palaces of Spain, the galleries of France, the treasures assembled by Italian princes. He knew what great art looked like, and he knew England had almost none of it. The English royal holdings, such as they existed, consisted mainly of portraits. Family members, mostly. Some tapestries, religious paintings. Nothing that would impress a visiting ambassador from Venice or Madrid. Nothing that suggested England belonged in the same conversation as the great artistic powers of Europe. Charles decided to change that. He had the resources. The crown controlled vast wealth. He had the taste. Unlike many monarchs who collected for status, Charles genuinely loved art. He could discuss technique with painters, debate composition with scholars. He knew what he was buying, and he had an opportunity. The Gonzaga family, Dukes of Mantua, needed money desperately. They'd assembled one of Europe's finest art collections over 2 centuries. Now they were broke and willing to sell. Charles sent agents to negotiate. The price was enormous, £15,000, equivalent to multiple millions today. For that, he acquired paintings by Titian, Raphael, Correggio, Mantegna. Works that had been in Gonzaga hands for generations, masterpieces that most collectors could only dream of owning. The paintings arrived in England in 1628. Charles distributed them among his palaces. Hampton Court got many, Windsor received others. Whitehall Palace, his primary London residence, became a showcase for the finest pieces. But he didn't stop with the Gonzaga purchase. He bought constantly. Italian paintings, Flemish works, anything that met his standards. He commissioned portraits from Anthony van Dyck, who became his court painter and created some of the most iconic royal images ever made. Van Dyck's canvases of Charles became the definitive image of the king. Charles on horseback in armor, looking every inch the martial monarch. Charles in elegant dress, sophisticated and cultured. Charles with his family, the perfect picture of royal domesticity. These weren't just portraits, they were propaganda, presenting the king as he wanted to be seen. Rubens visited England in 1629 on a diplomatic mission. He toured the royal galleries and reported back to colleagues on the continent that the English king had assembled something genuinely impressive, holdings that could stand comparison with those in Italy, France, and Spain. For a brief moment, Charles had achieved his goal. England had a royal art treasury worthy of a major European power. Then everything collapsed. The 1640s brought civil war. Charles versus Parliament, King versus Commons, Royalist versus Roundhead. The disputes were partly religious, partly political, partly about who actually controlled England, but they ended with armies in the field and the king on the losing side. He tried negotiating, he tried escaping, he tried raising new armies. Nothing worked. By 1648, Parliament had him in custody and was debating what to do with a captured monarch. They decided to try him for treason against his own country. The trial was legally questionable at best. Kings weren't supposed to answer to anyone except God. But Parliament pushed forward anyway. Charles was convicted. The sentence was death. On January 30th, 1649, Charles Stuart walked onto a scaffold outside Whitehall Palace, the same palace where his art hung on every wall. He gave a brief speech, prayed, and laid his head on the block. England had executed its king. Now it had to figure out what to do with everything he owned. Parliament's solution was simple. Sell it. All of it. The palaces would remain crown property, but their contents were fair game. Furniture, tapestries, silver, jewels, and art. Everything would be liquidated to pay off debts and fill Parliament's treasury. The Commonwealth sale, as it became known, began in 1649 and continued for years. Agents catalogued every item in every royal palace. They assigned values. They found buyers. And piece by piece, the acquisitions dispersed. The Gonzaga paintings he'd worked so hard to obtain, put up for auction. Many went back to the continent. Some ended up in Spanish holdings. Others went to France. A few stayed in England, purchased by nobles who could afford them. The Van Dyck portraits? Liquidated. The Titians, the Raphaels, the Rubens canvases? Auctioned off. Everything. By the time the Commonwealth finished selling the royal possessions, one of Europe's finest art treasuries had been scattered across the continent. Paintings that had hung together for years in English palaces now resided in a dozen different countries. Some items stayed at Windsor, but only because they were considered part of the building itself. Tapestries too large to move. Paintings integrated into architectural features. A few pieces that commissioners determined belonged to the crown permanently rather to Charles personally. When Charles II returned from exile in 1660 to reclaim his father's throne, he found the royal holdings devastated. His father had spent decades building something extraordinary. Parliament had dismantled it in a decade. The new king tried to recover what he could. He sent agents across Europe tracking down pieces from the Commonwealth auctions. He managed to buy back a few items. but most were gone forever, absorbed into collections that had no intention of parting with them. The loss was staggering. Art historians still debate exactly what vanished in those sales. Records exist, but they're incomplete. Some paintings can be traced to current locations in museums or private holdings. Others disappeared entirely, their current whereabouts unknown. What we know for certain is this: Charles I assembled one of the great art treasuries of his era. He filled English palaces with masterworks. He brought artistic sophistication to a court that had previously lacked it. And then he lost his head, and Parliament auctioned everything he'd gathered. Windsor Castle kept a few pieces. Mantegna's triumphs of Caesar somehow survived, though historians still debate exactly why commissioners left them at Hampton Court. A handful of other works remained, overlooked or deemed unsellable, but the vast majority vanished, dispersed, lost to England forever. It would take another century before British monarchs assembled holdings approaching what Charles had built, and when they did, they would be far more careful about keeping them safe. Chapter 4. George III's Venetian Obsession. George III became king in 1760. He was 22 years old, earnest, and determined to be nothing like his predecessors. His grandfather, George II, had barely spoken English. His great-grandfather, George I, had spent most of his reign wishing he was back in Hanover. The first two George treated England like a business arrangement, useful, profitable, but not home. George III was different, born in England, raised in England, English to his core. He wanted to be a proper British king, and that meant investing in British institutions, including the royal art holdings. What he inherited was respectable, but incomplete. Charles II had recovered some pieces after the Commonwealth disaster. Subsequent monarchs had added more, but gaps remained. Entire schools of painting were barely represented. The treasury lacked depth. George had advisors who understood art. They knew what was missing. They knew where to find it. And in 1762, they presented him with an extraordinary opportunity. Joseph Smith was dying. Smith had served as British consul in Venice for decades. He'd lived there so long he was practically Venetian himself. He spoke the language fluently, knew every dealer and artist in the city, and had spent 50 years assembling one of the finest private art collections in Europe. He was also broke. Smith had spent everything on art. His palazzo overflowed with paintings, drawings, books, manuscripts, works by the Venetian master Canaletto by the dozen, canvases by Vermeer, Holbein, Parmigianino, drawings by Raphael and Michelangelo, rare books and illuminated manuscripts, half a century of careful, knowledgeable collecting. Now he needed money, and he had no heirs. Everything would have to be dispersed after his death anyway. Better to sell it intact to someone who would keep it together. George's advisors moved quickly. They negotiated a price for the entire assemblage. Every painting, every drawing, every book. One transaction, one price. No splitting it up. The deal closed in 1762. The exact amount paid remains uncertain, but contemporary sources suggest around £20,000. For that, George acquired what would become the core of Windsor's art treasury. The shipment from Venice was enormous, crates filled with paintings, hundreds of them. More than 170 works by the Venetian view painter alone, not sketches or studies but finished canvases. Views of Venice that captured the city in meticulous detail. The Grand Canal, the Bacino di San Marco, the Piazza San Marco. Every major landmark, painted with precise, luminous technique. This artist had been popular with British collectors for decades. English nobles on the Grand Tour bought his work as souvenirs. Paintings of Venice to hang in their country houses, reminders of sophisticated travel. But nobody owned Venetian views like George now did. The Smith acquisition gave him the largest single holding of such paintings ever assembled. But these remarkable cityscapes, impressive as they were, weren't even the most valuable part of the transaction. Buried in the shipment was a painting by Johannes Vermeer, The Music Lesson. Painted around 1662, exactly a century before George bought it. A woman stands at a virginals, a keyboard instrument. A man watches from beside her. Sunlight streams through windows on the left, illuminating the scene with that characteristic Vermeer glow. The floor tiles recede in perfect perspective. Every detail rendered with impossible precision. Vermeer paintings were already rare in 1762. Only a few dozen existed, and most were in Dutch collections. George's advisors may not have fully grasped what they were obtaining. Vermeer wasn't yet the revered master he would become in later centuries. But they knew the painting was good. Very good. Today, art historians estimate only 34 Vermeer paintings exist worldwide. Windsor's Music Lesson is one of them. Its value is effectively incalculable. If it ever came to auction, which it never will, estimates suggest it would exceed $200 million. George didn't make the Smith acquisition for investment purposes. He bought it because his advisors told him it would elevate the royal holdings to a level befitting a major European power. And they were right. The paintings went to Windsor Castle. The drawings and books went to the Royal Library. Everything stayed together, intact, exactly as Smith had assembled it. George continued adding to the treasury throughout his reign. He obtained more drawings, more paintings, more books. He patronized British artists, commissioned portraits, supported the Royal Academy, but the Smith transaction remained his greatest single accomplishment. Nothing else came close to its scale or significance. The Venetian view paintings transformed how Windsor displayed art. So many depictions of the same city, all by the same hand, created a kind of gallery within the palace. Rooms where every wall showed another vista of Venice. The effect was immersive, transporting. Visitors to Windsor could tour Venice without leaving England. The assemblage also included works that filled gaps in the royal holdings, Italian Renaissance drawings that had been missing, Northern European paintings underrepresented in previous acquisitions. The Smith material didn't just add to what existed, it completed the treasury in crucial ways. George's advisors had chosen well. Smith wasn't just a wealthy collector who bought whatever looked impressive. He had genuine expertise. He knew Venetian art intimately. He bought quality, not quantity. And his decades of patient work had produced something coherent and valuable. When the crates arrived at Windsor, staff unpacked treasures that would still be there 2.5 centuries later. The same Venetian cityscapes George obtained in 1762 hang in Windsor's state apartments today. The same Vermeer. The same drawings. Barely anything from the Smith material has left Windsor since it arrived. That kind of continuity is rare in art history. Collections get dispersed. Heirs sell pieces. Museums trade or lend. But the Smith holdings stayed put, anchored at Windsor, becoming so integral to the palace that removing any part became unthinkable. George III's acquisition did more than add art to Windsor. It established the royal treasury as one of the great holdings in Europe. It gave British monarchs something they could display with pride to visiting dignitaries. It showed that England, so often considered culturally inferior to France and Italy, could compete in at least one arena. And it concentrated an astonishing amount of artistic wealth in a single location. One castle, on the Thames, now held more views of Venice than Venice itself. Held a Vermeer in an era when Vermeers were vanishingly rare, held drawings by Renaissance masters that scholars traveled across Europe to study. The deal had one other effect, perhaps unintended. It made Windsor Castle a target, not militarily. England's enemies weren't going to attack Windsor to steal paintings, but it made the castle uniquely vulnerable to fire, theft, and disaster. Because once you concentrate that much value in one place, you have to protect it, forever, with perfect vigilance. One mistake, one failure of security or fire suppression, and centuries of accumulation could vanish. George III never worried about that. The paintings arrived, they were hung, and they stayed there. Safe, secure, protected by stone walls and royal authority. But in later centuries, as the treasury continued to grow, as more masterpieces accumulated at Windsor, that vulnerability would become increasingly apparent. And in 1992, it would nearly prove catastrophic. Chapter 5. The Vault Nobody Sees. Most visitors to Windsor Castle never learn about the vault. They walk through the state apartments. They admire the paintings on display. They tour St. George's Chapel. They watch the changing of the guard. Then they leave, having seen what Windsor wants them to see. What they don't see is the print room. It sits within the castle's private quarters, behind doors tourists never pass through. Climate-controlled, humidity-regulated, temperature constant year-round. Light levels kept deliberately low. Security tight enough that even most castle staff can't access it without authorization. Inside are 550 works by Leonardo da Vinci, the largest collection of Leonardo's art anywhere in the world. More than the Louvre holds. More than any Italian museum. More than all the museums in Florence combined. All kept in flat storage, in near darkness, seen by almost nobody. Leonardo died in 1519. He left behind fewer than 20 finished paintings. Most are in museums now. The Mona Lisa in Paris. The Last Supper painted on a wall in Milan. Virgin of the Rocks in London. Maybe a dozen others scattered across Europe. But Leonardo was more than a painter. He was an engineer, scientist, anatomist, architect, inventor. He spent decades filling notebooks with observations, experiments, designs, studies of human anatomy showing muscles and bones with surgical precision, sketches of machines that wouldn't be built for centuries, observations of water flow, plant growth, geological formations, maps, architectural plans, ideas for weapons, flying machines, hydraulic systems. He drew constantly, thousands of pages. Most were bound into notebooks after his death. Those notebooks have been broken up, dispersed, lost. Pages survive in scattered collections around the world. But the single largest group ended up at Windsor. How they got there is a story of luck and timing. When Leonardo died, his work passed to his assistant, Francesco Melzi. Melzi kept everything together for decades, treating it as precious inheritance. But after Melzi's death in 1570, his heirs didn't share his reverence. They saw old papers, not treasures. Some notebooks were sold. Others simply disappeared. Around 1590, a sculptor named Pompeo Leoni got his hands on many of these loose sheets. Leoni worked in Milan and Madrid. He collected Leonardo's output obsessively. He gathered pages from multiple sources, trying to reassemble what had been scattered. Leoni didn't just collect, he reorganized. He took Leonardo's papers, which had been in notebooks organized by theme or chronology, and rearranged them. He glued pages into large albums, creating his own order. Anatomy studies in one volume, architectural sketches in another. The process destroyed Leonardo's original organization, but it also kept hundreds of sheets together. Leoni bound his Leonardo albums in leather, magnificent volumes that looked impressive on a shelf. And then, sometime before 1613, when Leoni died, the albums made their way to England. Exactly how remains unclear. Some historians suggest Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel, brought them back from travels in Italy. Others think Charles I may have acquired them as part of his broader collecting efforts. What we know for certain is that by 1690, when inventories were compiled, the albums were in the royal collection. Charles II owned them. Whether he knew what he had is debatable. The volumes were listed in inventories simply as works by Leonardo. No special emphasis. Just another item in a large collection. The albums stayed at Windsor, through the 1700s, through the 1800s. Occasionally, someone would study them. Artists could request access to see specific pieces. Scholars wrote about them. But mostly they sat in storage, remarkable and ignored. In the 1900s, the Royal Collection finally began properly cataloging and conserving these treasures. Experts carefully removed pages from Leoni's albums, preserving them individually in archival conditions. They photographed everything. They cataloged every sheet. They researched provenance and dates. The work revealed just how extraordinary Windsor's Leonardo holdings were. anatomical studies showing dissections the artist performed himself, images of human hearts with accuracy that wouldn't be matched until modern medicine, sketches of muscles, tendons, bones, all labeled in Leonardo's distinctive mirror writing. He wrote right to left, backward, readable only in a mirror. Some scholars think he did it naturally, being left-handed. Others suggest he wanted to keep his notes private. The engineering material shows Leonardo's mind working through mechanical problems. Gears and pulleys, flying machines with wings that flap like birds, submarines, parachutes, tanks with cranks that turn wheels. Most were never built. Some couldn't work with period technology. But the thinking behind them was centuries ahead of his time. The nature studies are equally remarkable. Leonardo illustrated plants with botanical precision. He sketched cats in motion, capturing movement better than most photographers. He rendered flowing water, trying to understand turbulence and eddies. He depicted rocks and mountains, developing theories about geological formation. And then there are the face studies. Leonardo drew faces constantly, old men with wrinkled skin and flowing beards, young women with perfect features, grotesque caricatures with exaggerated noses and chins. He studied human expression, trying to understand how emotion shows in facial muscles. These studies fed directly into his paintings. The faces in The Last Supper, each showing different reactions to Christ's announcement of betrayal, came from years of observing people showing surprise, confusion, anger, denial. Windsor's collection includes all of this. It's not just quantity, it's breadth. Every aspect of Da Vinci's curiosity is represented. Every medium he used, pen and ink, red chalk, black chalk, silver point, wash different tools for different purposes, all wielded with incredible skill, but almost nobody sees them. The problem is light. Paper and ink degrade when exposed to light. Not quickly, not obviously, but over decades and centuries, light damage accumulates. Colors fade. Paper yellows and becomes brittle. The more a piece is displayed, the more it deteriorates. Windsor takes conservation seriously. These works survived 500 years. The goal is to preserve them for another 500. That means keeping them in darkness most of the time. Controlled temperature, controlled humidity, minimal handling, maximum preservation. Every few years, Windsor organizes a Leonardo exhibition. They select a small number of pieces, display them briefly, then return them to storage. The exhibitions draw enormous crowds. People line up for hours to see material that normally stays hidden. Then the exhibition ends, and everything goes back into the vault for years. 2019 marked 500 years since the artist's death. Windsor organized the largest Leonardo exhibition in over 6 decades. 200 pieces on display simultaneously. Lines stretched around the castle. Tickets sold out weeks in advance. Art historians traveled from around the world. And then it ended, and the works went back into darkness. This creates a strange situation. Windsor owns the world's greatest collection of Leonardo's output, but owning it means not showing it. Preservation requires invisibility. The better Windsor protects these treasures, the fewer people can ever see them. For most of history, this wasn't considered a problem. Royal collections were private. Kings owned art for their own enjoyment, not public display. If nobody saw the Leonardo material except occasional visiting scholars, that was fine. But modern expectations are different. People believe great art should be accessible. Museums exist to show collections, not hide them. Windsor straddles an uncomfortable line. It's a private residence that happens to hold public treasures. It's a home that functions as a museum. And in the print room, it guards works too valuable to display but too important to keep secret. The estimated value of Windsor's Leonardo holdings is meaningless. You can't really put a price on something that will never be sold. But if forced to estimate, art experts suggest the collection as a whole could be worth over $500 million. Some individual sheets would sell for millions each if they ever came to market. They won't. They can't. They belong to the crown in perpetuity. They're part of Windsor Castle as much as the walls themselves. Removing them would be like removing stones from the foundation. so they stay. In flat drawers, in controlled darkness, guarded and preserved, occasionally glimpsed, mostly hidden. The greatest collection of Leonardo da Vinci's work on Earth, kept in a vault that almost nobody enters. Chapter 6. The State Apartments, a Gallery of Masters. The public tour of Windsor Castle follows a specific route, through the entrance, up the grand staircase, into the state apartments, chamber after chamber of exactly what visitors came to see. Masterpieces, everywhere. Not in galleries with white walls and track lighting, not behind velvet ropes with museum labels explaining provenance and technique, just hanging there, on walls where they've hung for centuries, in spaces that monarchs still use when hosting state dinners and diplomatic receptions. The grand staircase sets the tone. Visitors climb broad stone steps beneath a painted ceiling showing classical scenes. Suits of armor line the walls, weapons from royal armories, and paintings, large ones, portraits of monarchs and military heroes. The message is clear. You're entering a palace that takes itself seriously. The first major space is King's Drawing Room. Red silk walls, gilded ceiling, furniture that looks too delicate to actually sit on, and displayed prominently, a Rubens. A religious scene, Mary holding the infant Christ, Joseph watching, painted in Rubens' characteristic Baroque style, rich colors, soft flesh tones, a sense of warmth and domesticity despite the sacred subject. The work has hung in the state apartments for over 2 centuries. It's not going anywhere. Move to the next chamber, and there's a Rembrandt. Then another Rembrandt in the space after that. Not small works either, full portraits. People rendered with that distinctive Rembrandt lighting. Dark backgrounds. Faces emerging from shadow, every wrinkle and imperfection visible. The artist wasn't interested in flattery. He painted what he saw. Van Dyck portraits appear throughout multiple apartments. Charles I on horseback, the same image we encountered earlier in the collection's history. Charles in elegant dress. Royal children posed formally. Van Dyck created the visual language of Stuart monarchy. These canvases defined how people saw their king. The Canaletto paintings create their own effect. So many views of Venice concentrated in several galleries. The Grand Canal from different angles. The Bacino di San Marco with boats. The Piazza San Marco crowded with figures. Canaletto painted Venice with almost photographic precision. Every building rendered accurately. Every architectural detail correct. You could use his works as maps. Walk through enough spaces and patterns emerge. Windsor didn't just collect randomly. Certain artists appear repeatedly because monarchs loved their work. Certain subjects recur because they served political purposes. Portraits of monarchs and their families, obviously, but also pieces that conveyed messages about power, legitimacy, taste, sophistication. The quality stays consistently high. These aren't second-tier works by great masters. These are canvases that any museum would feature prominently, and they're displayed casually, almost carelessly, on walls where they have always been. Some pieces have been here so long that moving them seems wrong. The Rubens in that location belongs there, that Van Dyck fits perfectly on that wall. Curators could create more museum-like displays, but that would destroy the atmosphere. These apartments are meant to feel lived in, not curated. Which they are. The state apartments aren't just for tourists. When foreign leaders visit, they dine in these chambers, under these paintings, surrounded by this art. The Queen hosted state banquets in St. George's Hall, the very space that burned in 1992 and was meticulously restored. Guests sat at long tables beneath works worth millions, probably not thinking about the art because the setting felt so natural. That's Windsor's trick. The art doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists as part of the architecture, part of the decoration, part of the lived environment. You could walk through these galleries and barely register what you're seeing. Or you could stop at every canvas and realize you're surrounded by pieces that define Western art history. The carved wood details throughout the apartments add another layer. Grinling Gibbons, the master woodcarver, reportedly worked at Windsor in the late 1600s. His work appears throughout. Delicate carved flowers, fruit, leaves, all rendered in wood with impossible precision. Individual petals, stems, insects. Everything so detailed it looks real until you touch it and feel wood. The ceilings deserve attention too. Elaborate painted scenes, classical gods, allegorical figures, Baroque compositions covering entire ceilings. Antonio Verrio reportedly painted many of them in the 1680s. His style was fashionable then, dramatic, busy, figures floating in clouds, architecture rendered in perspective, the kind of ceiling treatment that makes you dizzy if you stare too long. Chamber after chamber continues like this. Art layered on art, canvases on walls, carved wood around doorways, painted ceilings overhead, furniture that's itself artistic, tapestries, porcelain, clocks, every surface decorated, every corner filled. The effect is overwhelming in the best way. This is what royal wealth looked like when it had centuries to accumulate. Not everything is old. Some furniture dates from the 19th century. Some decorative objects are relatively recent additions. But the core holdings, the major paintings and pieces, have been here for generations. They've survived wars, survived the fire, survived changing tastes and political upheavals. The state apartments reportedly receive around 1 million visitors annually. They walk through. They look. They take photos where permitted. They buy guidebooks describing what they're seeing. Most probably don't fully grasp the value of what surrounds them. A Rembrandt here, a Van Dyck there, a Canaletto in the next space, each worth tens of millions, all displayed like they're just normal decoration, which at Windsor they are. The tour route is carefully controlled. Visitors follow a specific path. They can't wander freely. They can't touch anything. Guards watch constantly. Security cameras cover every angle. Because while the atmosphere feels casual, the reality is anything but. Windsor is protecting billions of dollars worth of art in spaces that also function as working areas. The route eventually leads to the exit, through the gift shop, back out into the castle grounds. Visitors leave having seen perhaps 10% of Windsor's art holdings. The state apartments show the accessible pieces, the works that can withstand public viewing, the canvases robust enough to hang in chambers where tourists pass through daily. Everything else stays elsewhere, in storage, in private apartments, in vaults like the print room where Leonardo's work hides. The state apartments are Windsor's public face, impressive, historic, filled with masterpieces, but still just a fraction of what the castle actually contains. Chapter 7, St. George's Hall Reborn. The morning after the fire, officials toured the damage. What they found in St. George's Hall stopped them cold. Nothing remained. The ceiling, 180 feet of medieval oak beams and carved details, had collapsed completely. The walls still stood, blackened by smoke and cracked from heat. But everything inside the hall had burned. Furniture, tapestries, the wooden floor. Centuries of craftsmanship reduced to charred debris in 15 hours. St. George's Hall had been the ceremonial heart of Windsor Castle, the largest room in the entire complex. Knights of the Garter, Britain's oldest order of chivalry, held ceremonies there. State banquets filled long tables running the hall's length. Royal weddings, investitures, formal receptions, every major event at Windsor passed through this space. Now it was gone. The question facing officials was simple. Rebuild it exactly as it was, or create something new? Both options had supporters. Traditionalists argued for exact reconstruction. St. George's Hall had looked the same for centuries. Recreating it faithfully would honor that history. But modernists suggested this was an opportunity. Why not design something contemporary? Why not acknowledge that this was a 1990s rebuilding, not a medieval original? The debate continued for months. Architects submitted proposals. Historians weighed in. The public offered opinions. And eventually, a decision emerged. Rebuild it, but better. The goal wasn't just to recreate what had been lost, it was to build something that would last another 500 years. That meant modern engineering hidden beneath medieval appearance. Steel supports where medieval builders had used only wood, fire suppression systems invisibly integrated, climate control, modern wiring. Everything a 21st century building needs, all concealed behind a 14th century facade. The restoration took 5 years. Architects studied historical records, photographs, paintings showing the hall as it had appeared. They wanted accuracy, every carved detail, every painted shield, every proportion matching the original. But they also wanted improvement. The old ceiling had been heavy timber, dried over centuries, perfect fuel for fire. The new ceiling would use green oak, fresh wood that would age and season over decades, gradually matching the color and character of the original. But green oak is heavier, wetter, more resistant to fire. It shrinks as it dries, which meant engineers had to calculate how joints would behave over years as the wood settled. Craftsmen cut beams using traditional methods, hand tools, techniques unchanged since medieval times. But they also used modern engineering to ensure structural integrity. The beams look medieval. They're shaped medieval. But they're anchored with steel and designed using computer modeling. The carved details required incredible skill. Medieval craftsmen had created elaborate decorations, shields showing coats of arms for every knight of the garter who'd ever lived, heraldic symbols, crown moldings, decorative panels. All of it had to be recreated by hand. Stone carvers worked from historical photographs and architectural drawings. They matched techniques to the period, not modern power tools, traditional chisels and mallets. The work was slow. Each shield took weeks. Each decorative element required careful study of how medieval craftsmen would have approached it. The painted elements created another challenge. The original ceiling had been decorated with painted heraldry, bright colors, gold leaf, intricate patterns. Restoring that meant not just recreating designs, but matching medieval paint techniques. The pigments, the application methods, the way paint ages on wood. Conservators worked on paintings that had survived the fire. Many had been smoke damaged. Some had water damage from firefighting efforts. Each required careful cleaning, repair, restoration. The goal was to return them to how they'd looked before the fire, while also ensuring they'd survive another few centuries. Throughout the restoration, workers found opportunities to improve fire safety without compromising appearance. The new ceiling included concealed fire detection systems, sprinklers hidden in carved details, temperature sensors, smoke detectors, everything the 1990s could offer for fire prevention, all invisible to anyone standing in the completed hall. The floor received similar treatment. It looks like medieval oak planking, but beneath that wood lies modern fire-resistant construction. If another fire starts, the hall is designed to contain it, suppress it, and alert security immediately. By 1997, 5 years after the fire, St. George's Hall was ready. The official reopening drew crowds. People who remembered the hall before the fire came to see if the restoration matched their memories. Architecture critics examined details. Historians assessed accuracy. The verdict was overwhelmingly positive. The hall looked medieval, it felt authentic, but it was also clearly better built than the original. Stronger, safer, designed to survive disasters the medieval builders never imagined. The cost was substantial, £37 million, equivalent to over $70 million today. But the expense bought more than just a restored room. It bought peace of mind. Windsor would never lose St. George's Hall to fire again. Not with modern suppression systems, not with fire-resistant materials, not with constant monitoring. The hall returned to its ceremonial functions immediately. State banquets resumed. Nights of the Garter ceremonies continued. The Queen hosted dinners for visiting heads of state. Everything that had happened in St. George's Hall before the fire now happened again, in a space that looked identical but performed infinitely better. Visitors today walk through St. George's Hall and see medieval grandeur. Most don't realize they're standing in a 1990s reconstruction. The shields look centuries old. The beams appear weathered by time. The floor seems ancient, Only the absence of wear patterns gives it away. The wood is too perfect, the stone too clean. It will take decades for the hall to develop the patina of age, but it will. The green oak ceiling is already darkening. The beams are settling. The joints are tightening as the wood dries. In 50 years, the hall will look genuinely medieval. In 100 years, only experts will be able to distinguish restored sections from original fabric. The fire taught Windsor an expensive lesson about vulnerability. No matter how strong the walls, no matter how carefully maintained, disaster can strike. The response to that lesson was to rebuild stronger. To accept that complete historical authenticity mattered less than ensuring survival. St. George's Hall stands as proof that you can honor history while acknowledging reality. The room looks backward, but it's built for the future. And the paintings that hang on its walls, the ceremonies that fill its space, the art collection it helps protect, all exist within a shell designed to never burn again. Chapter 8. The Vermeer Mystery. 34 paintings, that's all. In the entire world, scholars agree on 34 paintings definitely created by Johannes Vermeer. Maybe 35 if you count disputed attributions. Maybe 33 if you question a few. But roughly 34, that's it. Most major artists left hundreds of works. Rembrandt painted over 300 canvases. Rubens created over 1,000. Even artists who died young usually left dozens of pieces behind. Vermeer painted 34, and then disappeared from history for 2 centuries. He lived in Delft, a prosperous Dutch city known for pottery and trade. Born in 1632, died in 1675 at age 43. Married, had 11 children, worked as an art dealer in addition to painting, struggled financially despite creating masterpieces, died in debt. Contemporary records barely mention him. A few guild documents, some financial records. Almost no commentary on his art. He wasn't famous during his lifetime. Not obscure exactly, but not celebrated. Just another Dutch painter making a modest living in a city full of artists. After his death, Vermeer vanished from art history. His paintings were attributed to other artists. Collectors owned them without knowing who painted them. Museums displayed them as works by more famous Dutch masters. For over 200 years, Johannes Vermeer might as well have never existed. Then, in the mid-1800s, a French art critic named Théophile Thoré started investigating. He'd seen paintings attributed to various Dutch artists that seemed to share a distinctive style. The same treatment of light, the same domestic settings, the same quiet, contemplative mood. He began researching, tracking down documents, comparing works. Thoré published his findings in 1866. He'd identified 30 paintings by an obscure Dutch artist named Vermeer. Not 30 paintings among thousands, 30 paintings total. The entire known output of an artist who'd been forgotten for 2 centuries. The art world was skeptical at first. An unknown painter suddenly elevated to master status? But as scholars examined the works Thoré had identified, consensus emerged. These paintings were extraordinary, and they were all by the same hand. Vermeer's rediscovery created a problem. Only 30-odd paintings existed. Museums and collectors immediately wanted them. But there weren't enough to go around. Demand vastly exceeded supply. Prices skyrocketed. Forgeries appeared. The rarity made every genuine Vermeer priceless. Windsor's painting had been in the collection since 1762, acquired as part of the Joseph Smith purchase. At the time, it was just listed as Dutch interior scene. Nobody knew it was a Vermeer because nobody remembered who Vermeer was. Only after Thoré's research did Windsor realize what it owned. One of 34 paintings by a rediscovered master. A work that would become one of the most valuable pieces in the entire collection. The music lesson shows Vermeer's characteristic style perfectly. A woman stands at a virginals, a keyboard instrument popular in wealthy Dutch homes. A man stands beside her, watching. Sunlight streams through windows on the left, illuminating the scene with that distinctive Vermeer glow. Everything in the painting feels real. The floor tiles recede in perfect linear perspective. The light behaves exactly as light should, reflecting off surfaces, creating shadows, modeling forms. The fabrics show texture. The instruments look playable. You could walk into this room. It exists. But it's also clearly arranged. Vermeer didn't just paint what he saw. He composed carefully. The woman's position, the man's stance, the angle of light, the placement of furniture. Everything is calculated to create balance and harmony. The painting has another Vermeer characteristic: stillness. Nothing is happening. The woman plays, the man listens. That's it. No drama, no action, no story being told, just a quiet moment, captured and frozen. This is what makes Vermeer distinctive. Other Dutch painters showed active scenes, market crowds, family gatherings, tavern brawls. Vermeer painted silence. Domestic interiors where nothing happens except light falling across a room and people existing in space. The technical skill required to paint like this is extraordinary. That light on the floor isn't just painted bright. It actually glows. The shadows aren't just dark paint. They have depth and color. The reflection in the mirror on the wall is accurate. Vermeer understood optics in ways most painters didn't. Some scholars think he used a camera obscura, an optical device that projects images through a lens. It would explain his precise perspective and lighting. But even if he used such tools, the skill is in the painting itself. Knowing what you're seeing and painting it accurately are different abilities. Windsor's Vermeer is one of only 3 in British collections. The National Gallery in London has 2. That's it for the entire United Kingdom. 3 Vermeers among thousands of museums and galleries. Compare that to the United States, which has 12 Vermeers spread across various museums. The Frick Collection in New York has 3, the only institution besides the National Gallery with multiple works. The Metropolitan Museum has 5. The National Gallery in Washington has 3. That distribution shows how rare these paintings are. Major museums consider themselves fortunate to own even 1. Having 2 is exceptional. The Frick's 3 makes it a Vermeer center. And Windsor, which isn't even a traditional museum, has one of the finest examples, displayed casually in the state apartments as if it's just another painting in a collection full of paintings. The estimated value is meaningless because it will never be sold. But for comparison, when a disputed Vermeer came to auction in recent years, estimates suggested it could bring over $200 million. Windsor's painting, which nobody disputes, would likely exceed that significantly. Only 1 Vermeer has been stolen and never recovered. The Concert, taken from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston in 1990. Thieves cut it from its frame during a brazen robbery that also took Rembrandt works and other masterpieces. The painting remains missing. Its value, according to FBI estimates, exceeds any other stolen artwork in history. Windsor's Vermeer is protected accordingly. Security in the state apartments is constant. Guards, cameras, alarm systems. The painting never travels. It never leaves Windsor. The risk is too great. Vermeer's technique has been studied extensively. Conservators have examined every millimeter of Windsor's painting using modern technology. X-rays show underdrawing beneath the paint. Infrared reveals changes Vermeer made during composition. Microscopic analysis identifies pigments. What they've found confirms Vermeer's extraordinary skill. His paint application is remarkably thin. He built up colors in transparent layers. He used expensive pigments, particularly ultramarine blue made from ground lapis lazuli. The cost alone shows these weren't commercial paintings churned out for quick sale. The mystery remains. Why so few paintings? 43 years of life, 20-odd years of active painting, 34 known works. That's less than 2 paintings per year. Was he incredibly slow? Did other works get destroyed? Are there paintings misattributed to other artists that are actually Vermeer's? Scholars keep looking. Occasionally someone proposes that a painting previously attributed to another Dutch master might actually be a Vermeer. Technical analysis follows. Usually the attribution is rejected. But hope persists that somewhere, forgotten in a private collection or misidentified in a museum, another Vermeer waits to be discovered. Meanwhile, the 34 accepted works remain among the most studied, most valuable, most protected paintings in existence. And Windsor owns one, hanging in the state apartments. Vermeer's light still glowing, his domestic scene still silent, his mystery intact. Chapter 9. What It's Worth. The $5 billion question. Put a price on Windsor Castle's art collection, and you encounter an immediate problem. How do you value something that will never be sold? Art appraisers use comparable sales. A Rembrandt sold for $50 million? Then similar Rembrandts are worth roughly that. A Vermeer estimated at $200 million. Other Vermeers fall in that range. The market provides benchmarks. But Windsor's collection will never reach the market. It belongs to the crown in perpetuity. It cannot be sold, traded, or given away. Legally, it's held in trust for the nation. The monarch is custodian, not owner in the commercial sense. So when experts estimate Windsor's collection at $5 billion or more, they're performing a hypothetical exercise. What would this art be worth if it could be sold? Which it can't. Which makes the number simultaneously meaningful and meaningless. Start with the Leonardo drawings. 550 sheets. Conservative estimates suggest $10 million per drawing for major works. Minor sketches might bring $5 million. Quick calculations reach over $500 million for the Leonardo collection alone. Some experts suggest the total could exceed $1 billion if every sheet reached its potential value at auction. The Vermeer would likely exceed $200 million. Only 34 exist. Demand is effectively infinite. Supply is fixed. Any Vermeer reaching auction would trigger bidding wars among the world's wealthiest collectors and institutions. The Rembrandts are harder to value. Windsor has multiple works. Rembrandt paintings vary wildly in price depending on subject, size, condition, and provenance. Major portraits bring 50 to 80 million. Smaller works might sell for 20 to 30 million. Windsor's collection likely contains 200 million or more in Rembrandt works alone. The Canaletto paintings present another calculation problem. Windsor owns over 50. Individual Canalettos sell for 5 to 20 million depending on quality and subject, but flooding the market with 50 at once would depress prices. Scarcity drives value. Remove scarcity and value drops. Still, the Canaletto collection likely represents over $300 million at conservative estimates. Then there are hundreds of other paintings. Van Dyck's, Rubens's, Titian's, Renaissance works, each worth millions individually, collectively worth hundreds of millions more. Add the furniture. Windsor's collection includes pieces from the greatest craftsmen in history, gilded French furniture worth millions per piece, English pieces by master cabinet makers, clocks, porcelain, tapestries, decorative arts that any museum would feature prominently. The crown jewels, kept at the Tower of London but part of the broader royal collection, are valued separately and impossibly. The stones alone are worth hundreds of millions, but their historical value makes them effectively priceless. Add everything together and you reach numbers that stop making sense. $5 billion is the conservative estimate. Some experts suggest $8 billion. Others say $10 billion or more. The range depends on assumptions about auction performance, market conditions, and whether items would be sold individually or in groups. But again, these are theoretical numbers. Windsor will never test them in practice. What the collection requires instead is protection, and protection costs money. Serious money. Security at Windsor operates at levels most museums can't afford. Armed police patrol constantly. Every entrance is monitored. Every room has cameras. Motion detectors cover spaces where tourists don't go. The security infrastructure alone costs millions annually to maintain and staff. Then there's fire suppression. After 1992, Windsor upgraded every system. State-of-the-art fire detection. Sprinklers hidden in architectural details. Suppression systems that can flood spaces with inert gas to starve fires of oxygen without damaging art. Heat sensors, smoke detectors, redundant systems backing up primary systems. The cost of these upgrades ran into tens of millions. The annual maintenance adds millions more. But compared to the value of what they're protecting, the expense is negligible. One fire destroying even a fraction of the collection would cost billions. Climate control adds another expense. The print room where Leonardo drawings reside maintains precise temperature and humidity year-round. Too much moisture damages paper. Too little makes it brittle. Temperature fluctuations cause expansion and contraction that weakens materials over centuries. The state apartments face similar challenges. Paintings on display need stable conditions. Not too hot, not too cold, not too humid, not too dry. Lighting must be bright enough for visitors to see, but not so bright it accelerates fading. Every room requires monitoring and adjustment. Conservation staff work constantly. Paintings need cleaning, frames need repair, gilding needs touching up. Furniture requires refinishing. Tapestries need stabilizing. The work never ends because the collection never stops aging. Windsor employs teams of conservators. Each specializes in different materials. Paintings conservators, paper conservators, furniture specialists, textile experts, metalwork specialists, all working to slow inevitable deterioration. Their tools are sophisticated. Microscopes to examine paint layers, infrared cameras to see beneath surfaces, X-ray machines to reveal underdrawings, chemical analysis to identify original materials, digital imaging to document condition over time. The conservation lab resembles a hospital, climate-controlled, spotlessly clean, equipped with technology that would have seemed like science fiction decades ago. The investment in equipment and training runs into millions. Then there's insurance. Or rather, there isn't. The British government self-insures the royal collection. No private insurance company would take the risk. The premiums would be astronomical. Instead, the government accepts the financial responsibility. If something happens, the loss falls on the public treasury. This creates interesting incentives. The government wants to minimize risk because any loss costs taxpayers money. That means investing heavily in prevention, better security, better fire suppression, better climate control. Spending millions on protection makes sense when you're self-insuring billions in art. It also means transparency about risk. Government officials regularly assess Windsor's security and conservation measures. Reports get filed. Improvements get recommended. Nothing is left to chance or complacency. The 1992 fire proved the system works. Staff knew exactly what to save and how to save it. Evacuation procedures functioned perfectly. Most art survived because people had trained for exactly that emergency, but the fire also showed vulnerabilities. It started in the private chapel, an area with fewer visitors and less constant monitoring. It spread through old timber. It moved faster than anyone anticipated. If the fire had started at night or in a different location, the losses could have been catastrophic. Since then, improvements have been constant. More sensors, better suppression, faster response capabilities. The goal is to ensure another fire never destroys what 1992 nearly did. The question of value remains theoretical. Windsor's collection is worth billions only in the abstract sense that selling it would generate billions. But selling it would also destroy what makes it valuable. These paintings aren't just expensive objects. They're cultural heritage, national treasures, art that belongs to Britain in ways that transcend ownership. You can't sell the Mona Lisa or the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Some things are simply beyond commerce. Windsor's collection occupies that category, worth billions, priceless, protected at enormous expense, and never ever for sale. Chapter 10. Who really owns Windsor? The answer seems obvious. The king owns Windsor Castle, King Charles III. It's his residence, his art, his property. Except it isn't. Not exactly. Windsor Castle is owned by the reigning monarch in right of the crown. That peculiar legal phrase means something specific. The king possesses Windsor as monarch, not as Charles Mountbatten Windsor, the private individual. He can't sell it, can't give it away, can't even technically leave it to his heirs in a will. When Charles dies, Windsor passes automatically to the next monarch, William, presumably. Not through inheritance in the normal sense, through succession. The crown transfers, and everything held in right of the crown transfers with it. This arrangement dates back centuries. It separates the person from the position. Kings and queens are temporary. The monarchy is permanent. Property held by the monarchy remains with the institution, regardless of which individual occupies the throne. So Charles lives at Windsor, uses Windsor, his staff maintains Windsor, but he doesn't own Windsor the way private citizens own their homes. He's custodian, not proprietor. The art collection follows the same principle. The paintings, drawings, furniture, all the masterpieces we've discussed belong to the crown. Charles can't sell the Vermeer to fund his lifestyle, can't gift a Rembrandt to a friend, can't even loan pieces to museums without proper authorization. The Royal Collection Trust manages everything. Established in 1987, it's a department of the royal household responsible for the care and conservation of the collection. The trust employs curators, conservators, historians, security staff, hundreds of people whose job is maintaining and protecting the art. Crucially, the trust is not funded by taxpayers. It operates on revenue from visitors. When tourists pay to tour Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, or other royal residences, that money goes to the trust. Entrance fees fund conservation, security, exhibitions, acquisitions. The collection supports itself. This wasn't always the case. Before 1993, the Royal Collection was maintained using money from the civil list, the annual payment Parliament made to support the monarchy. But after the Windsor fire, when restoration costs mounted, public opinion shifted. Why should taxpayers fund palaces when the monarchy was already wealthy? The solution was to open Windsor and Buckingham Palace to paying visitors during months when the monarch wasn't in residence. Summer openings became permanent. Tourists queued for tickets. The revenue covered not just restoration costs, but ongoing conservation and maintenance. Today, Windsor Castle welcomes around 1.5 million visitors annually. Tickets cost roughly £30 per adult. That's £45 million in ticket revenue yearly, minus operating costs. The money funds everything the trust does. It's a clever arrangement. The monarchy maintains its palaces and art without burdening taxpayers. The public gains access to spaces previously private. Everyone benefits. But it creates tensions. Windsor remains a working royal residence. Charles stays there on weekends. The state apartments close when he's present. Tourists are turned away. The castle functions as both home and museum, never fully one or the other. The trust must balance competing needs. Conservation requires limiting exposure. Every visitor through the state apartments brings risk. Moisture from breath. Heat from bodies. Potential accidents. But revenue requires visitors. No visitors means no funding. No funding means conservation suffers. The solution is careful management. Visitor numbers are capped. Routes are controlled. Certain rooms stay closed to minimize wear. The most fragile items remain in storage. What's displayed is robust enough to withstand public viewing. The governance structure adds another layer of complexity. The Royal Collection Trust is technically a department of the royal household, but it operates with considerable independence. The chairman is appointed by the monarch. The board includes art experts, historians, financial specialists. They make decisions about acquisitions, loans, exhibitions, conservation priorities. Charles, as monarch, technically has final say, but in practice, he defers to experts. The trust operates like any major museum. Professional staff make professional decisions. The monarch's role is more symbolic than operational. This matters for the art. Monarchs have personal taste. Charles might prefer certain artists or periods, but he can't simply redecorate Windsor with his favorites and sell off pieces he doesn't like. The trust protects the collection from individual whims. It also protects the collection from political pressure. Governments change. Prime ministers come and go. But the trust continues unchanged. The collection stays intact regardless of who's in power. Abdication creates interesting questions. If Charles abdicated tomorrow, what happens to the art? Nothing. It stays exactly where it is. William becomes king. The collection transfers automatically. Charles would leave Windsor, move to private residences, and have no further claim to the art. This has happened before. Edward VIII abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson. The royal collection stayed with George VI. Edward left with his personal possessions, but none of the crown property. It could happen again. Abdication doesn't mean the art gets divided or disputed. The collection remains whole. The new monarch inherits the same custodial responsibility. The system also handles loans and exhibitions. Museums worldwide request loans from the royal collection. The trust evaluates each request. Is the borrowing institution reputable? Can they provide adequate security? Will environmental conditions protect the art? If satisfied, loans proceed. Windsor pieces appear in exhibitions globally, then return home. The trust also makes acquisitions. Not frequently. The collection is already enormous, but occasionally opportunities arise. A historically significant piece comes to market. A gap in the collection can be filled. The trust purchases if funding allows. Recent acquisitions focus on filling holes in the historical record. Objects that illustrate how the collection was formed. Papers documenting provenance. Items that contextualize what already exists. The goal isn't growth for its own sake, it's completing the story. The digital age adds new possibilities. The Trust has photographed and cataloged the entire collection. Researchers worldwide can access records online. Students can study pieces they'll never see in person. The collection becomes globally accessible without physical travel. This democratization changes what ownership means. Yes, Charles is custodian. Yes, the Trust manages day-to-day operations. But in a meaningful sense, the collection belongs to everyone. It's humanity's heritage, not one family's private property. The custodial arrangement ensures it stays protected and accessible. That's ultimately why the in right of the crown structure matters. It transforms private ownership into public stewardship. The monarch serves the collection serves the public, and Windsor remains what it's been for centuries, a repository of artistic heritage, protected by royal authority, but held in trust for generations yet to come. Chapter 11. The Pieces That Got Away. Not everything stayed at Windsor. Over 5 centuries, pieces have left the collection, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through theft, sometimes lost to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Each departure tells a story about changing priorities, desperate times, or simple bad luck. The biggest losses came in the Commonwealth sale. We've already discussed how Parliament liquidated Charles I's collection after his execution. Hundreds of masterpieces dispersed across Europe. The Gonzaga paintings he'd worked so hard to acquire. Works by Titian, Raphael, Mantegna, all auctioned off to pay debts and fund the new government. Charles II tried recovering what he could after the Restoration in 1660. He sent agents across Europe tracking down pieces from the Commonwealth sale. They found some. A few collectors were willing to sell back to the crown, others refused, and many paintings had simply vanished into private collections where they remain today. The Louvre in Paris holds several paintings that once belonged to Charles I. So does the Prado in Madrid. Museums across Europe display works that passed through Windsor before being sold in the 1650s. Occasionally, curators discover a painting's provenance traces back to the English royal collection. But by then, it's been gone for centuries. Nobody's giving it back. George IV created his own losses. He inherited a substantial collection when he became king in 1820. But George had expensive tastes and constant money problems. He spent lavishly on building projects, parties, mistresses. When funds ran low, he sold art, not major pieces usually. George understood value. He knew the Rembrandts and Canalettos were irreplaceable. But lesser works, paintings by minor masters, those could generate cash without devastating the collection. Records show he sold dozens of pieces during his reign to fund his lifestyle. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert took a different approach. They didn't sell art, they gave it away. Gifts to family members, presents to visiting dignitaries, tokens of appreciation to loyal servants. The gifts were usually smaller items, drawings, prints, decorative objects, but over decades they added up. Victoria particularly liked giving family members pieces from the collection. A niece's wedding might merit a painting. A nephew's birthday could bring a valuable drawing. She saw it as sharing family heritage. Nobody objected because Victoria was queen and could do as she pleased. Some of those pieces still surface occasionally. An auction house announces a drawing with royal provenance. The documentation shows Victoria gave it to a relative in the 1870s. Now descendants are selling. It's perfectly legal. Victoria owned the item personally and could gift it, but it means the piece left the official collection permanently. Theft is rarer but not unknown. Windsor's security has always been substantial, but determined thieves occasionally succeed. In 1990, during renovations at Windsor, several small items disappeared. Silver boxes, miniature portraits, nothing on the scale of the Leonardo drawings or major paintings, but valuable nonetheless. Some were recovered, others remain missing. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist in Boston offers a cautionary tale about what Windsor avoids through vigilant security. In 1990, thieves dressed as police officers talked their way into the museum, tied up guards, and spent 81 minutes stealing 13 artworks. They took a Vermeer, 3 Rembrandts, 5 Degas works, and others. Total value estimated at $500 million. The paintings remain missing 35 years later. The empty frames still hang where the paintings were cut from them. The museum offers a $10 million reward. The FBI continues investigating, but nobody knows where the art is. Windsor could suffer a similar loss if security ever failed. The Leonardo drawings alone would be an irresistible target for sophisticated thieves. One print room raid could net artwork worth hundreds of millions. That's why security operates at levels most museums can't afford. The risk is simply too great. Natural disasters pose another threat. The 1992 fire proved how quickly centuries of collecting can be endangered. But Windsor has also survived floods, storms, structural failures. Each incident risks damaging or destroying art. In 1824, a flood damaged portions of Windsor's lower floors. Water reached areas where paintings were stored. Several works sustained water damage. Conservators managed to save most, but the process took months, and some pieces never fully recovered. The Second World War created unique risks. German bombs fell on London regularly. Windsor Castle, visible from miles away, presented an obvious target. The royal collection was partially evacuated. Major paintings went to country houses. The Leonardo drawings moved to secure locations far from likely bombing targets. St. George's Chapel's stained glass windows were removed and hidden. Windsor itself took precautions. Windows were sandbagged. Art that couldn't be moved was covered with protective materials. Firefighting equipment was positioned throughout. Staff drilled constantly on emergency procedures. The castle prepared for direct hits that mercifully never came. After the war, everything returned. The paintings, the drawings, the windows. Windsor resumed normal operations, but the evacuation proved that even the most secure location can become vulnerable during extraordinary times. Some losses are simply mysterious. Inventories from different centuries occasionally show pieces that vanish without explanation. A painting listed in 1700 doesn't appear in the 1750 inventory. No record of sale, no record of damage. It simply disappears from the books. These mysteries frustrate historians. Where did these pieces go? Were they destroyed in unreported accidents? Stolen by servants? Quietly sold without documentation? Given away and forgotten? Most likely all of the above. Record-keeping in earlier centuries was imperfect. Things got lost. Occasionally, lost pieces reappear. An auction house discovers a painting with royal provenance that nobody knew had left Windsor. Technical analysis confirms it's genuine. Documentation establishes it was once in the royal collection. Suddenly a lost piece isn't lost anymore, it's just somewhere else. The Royal Collection Trust sometimes tries to reacquire such pieces, if funding allows, if the current owner is willing to sell, if the piece fills an important gap. But usually lost items stay lost. They've been gone too long. They're part of other collections now. History moved on. What remains at Windsor is still extraordinary. Yes, pieces left over the centuries. But what stayed behind is more than sufficient. The Leonardo drawings, the Vermeer, the Rembrandts and Van Dycks and Canalettos, enough masterpieces to stock a dozen major museums. The goal now is simple. Keep what's left. Protect it. Preserve it. Ensure that 5 centuries from now, people can still see what we see today. No more Commonwealth sales. No more fires destroying irreplaceable art. No more casual gifts or desperate sales. Windsor learned its lessons, the hard way sometimes, but learned nonetheless. And the collection that remains, depleted though it may be from what could have been, still ranks among the greatest assemblages of art on earth. Chapter 12. Living with History, Windsor Today. Windsor Castle wakes early. By 7 in the morning, staff are already inside. Cleaners, security conservators checking overnight monitoring systems, maintenance crews addressing whatever issues arose during the night. The castle operates like a small city with infrastructure that never stops running. If King Charles is in residence, the royal standard flies from the round tower. Visitors arriving that day will find certain areas closed. The private apartments remain off-limits always, but when the monarch is present, restrictions extend further. Rooms used for official business close to tourists. Routes get adjusted. The castle shifts between its two identities. Home first, museum second. By 9, the first tour groups gather at the entrance, guides check tickets, visitors pass through security screening, bags inspected, metal detectors, security comparable to airports. Because Windsor isn't just protecting a building, it's protecting billions in art. The route guides visitors through takes them past masterpieces they may not fully appreciate. That Rembrandt on the wall? $50 million. The Van Dyck in the next room? $30 million. The Canaletto after that? $20 million. Most visitors take photos and move on, unaware they're walking through what amounts to a bank vault that happens to display its holdings. Guards watch constantly, not the ceremonial guards tourists photograph. Those are real soldiers performing real duties, but they're mostly symbolic. The actual security is subtler. Plainclothes officers, cameras in every corner, motion sensors, pressure plates. Technology most visitors never notice. The conservation work continues regardless of who's visiting. In labs tucked away from public areas, specialists examine paintings under microscopes. They analyze pigments. They photograph works in different light spectrums. They document condition. They plan treatments for pieces showing age or damage. This work never ends. Art is always deteriorating, slowly, imperceptibly, day to day. But over years and decades, the damage accumulates. Paint cracks. Canvas weakens, wood warps. The conservator's job is to slow this process as much as possible, to ensure that paintings 500 years old survive another 500. Climate control plays a crucial role. Every room has sensors monitoring temperature and humidity. Too hot and paint softens. Too cold and it becomes brittle. Too humid and mold grows. Too dry and materials crack. The systems adjust constantly, maintaining conditions that preserve art while keeping human visitors comfortable. The print room where Leonardo's work resides operates under stricter controls: temperature within 1 degree, humidity within 5%, light levels minimal. The room is effectively a preservation chamber that occasionally allows carefully supervised access. St. George's Chapel continues its religious function. Services happen regularly, weddings, funerals. The chapel isn't a museum, it's an active place of worship that happens to contain significant art and architecture. Queen Elizabeth II was buried there in September 2022, joining her parents and sister. Prince Philip rests there as well. The chapel serves both tourists and mourners. The castle's ceremonial role continues too. State banquets fill St. George's Hall. Foreign leaders dine under restored ceilings, surrounded by art worth hundreds of millions. The Garter Day ceremony happens annually. Knights of the Order process through the castle in elaborate medieval costumes, maintaining traditions centuries old. These events require careful coordination. How do you host a formal dinner for 200 people in rooms full of priceless art? The answer is meticulous planning. Tables placed to avoid artworks. Service routes mapped to minimize staff traffic near vulnerable pieces. Security heightened during events. Nothing left to chance. The Royal Collection Trust manages this complex operation. Their budget comes entirely from visitor revenue. Over 1 million people tour Windsor annually. Ticket prices fund everything: conservation, security staff salaries, maintenance, exhibitions. The castle supports itself through tourism. This creates pressure to maximize visitors while minimizing impact. More visitors mean more revenue, but also more wear. Crowds generate heat and humidity. Feet wear down floors, bodies brush against furniture. Every visitor creates tiny amounts of damage that accumulate over time. The trust balances these competing needs carefully. Visitor numbers are capped. Certain rooms close periodically for conservation. Routes get adjusted to spread wear evenly. The goal is sustainability. The castle must generate revenue without destroying what brings visitors in the first place. Digital initiatives extend access beyond physical visits. The Royal Collection website offers high-resolution images of thousands of pieces. Researchers can study works remotely. Students can write papers about paintings they've never seen in person. The collection becomes globally accessible. Virtual exhibitions allow even broader reach. During the pandemic, when Windsor closed to visitors, online presentations kept the collection accessible. People worldwide explored state apartments virtually, viewed Leonardo drawings on screens, learned about Vermeer from their homes. This technological access changes what it means to visit Windsor. Physical presence still offers something irreplaceable. Standing before an actual Rembrandt differs from viewing a digital reproduction. But for people who can't travel to England, digital access is better than nothing. The question facing Windsor now is what comes next. King Charles is 76. Prince William will eventually inherit the same custodial responsibilities his father and grandmother held. The collection will pass to him, then to his children. The cycle continues. Each generation faces the same challenge: preserve what was inherited, protect it from damage, loss, disaster, pass it forward intact. The fire of 1992 taught harsh lessons about vulnerability, but it also proved the system works. Staff knew what to save. They saved it. The collection survived. Future threats are harder to predict. Climate change could affect building stability. Rising temperatures might stress conservation systems. Political upheaval could endanger funding or security. Technology might enable new forms of theft. Every generation must adapt to its own challenges. What won't change is the fundamental responsibility. Windsor holds treasures that belong to humanity. Yes, they're legally owned by the Crown. Yes, they reside in England. But their significance transcends national boundaries. Leonardo's drawings matter to anyone who cares about art. Vermeer's paintings inspire people worldwide. The collection serves purposes larger than monarchy or nation. That's why the custodial system matters. It ensures continuity beyond individual lives. Kings die, monarchs change, but the institution persists, and the art remains protected by an authority that outlasts any single person. Visitors leaving Windsor today exit past gift shops selling guidebooks and postcards. They walk through grounds where medieval walls meet modern security. They've spent perhaps 3 hours inside, seen maybe 10% of the collection, and glimpsed a fraction of what Windsor actually contains. Most leave satisfied. They saw Rembrandt paintings. They toured grand apartments. They learned some history. They took photos for social media. They got their money's worth. What they may not fully grasp is the miracle they just witnessed. 5 centuries of collecting, 900 years of continuous occupation, art that survived civil wars, fires, world wars, and changing tastes, all concentrated in one castle on the Thames, all still there, still protected, still accessible. Windsor Castle isn't frozen in time. It evolves, it adapts, it serves new purposes while maintaining old ones. But through all the changes, its core purpose remains unchanged: to preserve beauty, to protect history, to ensure that what previous generations valued remains available to generations not yet born. That's what living with history means. Not treating the past as dead and static, but keeping it alive, inhabited, functional, relevant. Windsor does this better than perhaps any palace on earth, and the $5 billion in art hanging on its walls stands as proof that sometimes, miraculously, preservation works.